Today, what really happened in the Biden White House after October 7th?
The people who were making these decisions, that's dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of people who on a daily basis were choosing to enable this campaign of atrocities, mass starvation, collective punishment.
As U.S. officials resigned, dissent grew, and civil casualties mounted in Gaza, a new book reveals how the U.S. administration never wavered on its support of Israel and planted roots for the return of Donald Trump. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Before we jump into today's conversation, I need to tell you something. After nearly 8 years, and 7 of them with me behind the mic, this is a farewell episode of The Take. The podcast will continue in a new form, so check out what's coming and don't go far. But before we get to the show, I have to say the thing I'm proudest of isn't a number or an award, although those have been great. It's this team who have made what felt impossible possible. The people who trusted us with their stories. And you reminded us there was an audience hungry not just for breaking news, but for understanding. So from all of us at The Take, thank you for giving us your time. I know it's one of the most valuable things any of us has.
I'm Akbar Shahid Ahmed. I'm the diplomatic correspondent at Notice. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm the author of the forthcoming book, Crossing the Red Line, Biden, His Advisors, and Israel's War in Gaza.
Akbar, welcome back to The Take as a published author. I am really excited to see this book out in the world. And thank you for being here. We're speaking on Friday, June 26th, ending a week where 3 Democrats who made criticism of Israel central to their political identities won House primary races in New York City.
Former City Controller Brad Lander, Assemblymember Claire Valdez, and Daria-Liza Avila Chevalier, all endorsed by Mamdani, won seats in Tuesday's primaries.
You've been reporting on the Biden administration and the Democrats' thinking on Gaza for 3 years at least. How unlikely would this have been 3 years ago?
What these victories in New York showed us is what we once thought of as being really on the edge of what was acceptable to say about Israel, about Palestine, about America's complicity in the violence against Palestinians. That's really moving to more of the mainstream. And it's not disqualifying anymore. What these victories show is not only do AIPAC and sort of hardline pro-Israel forces not have that ability to exclude certain voices and perspectives from the conversation the way they could before. I'm conscious of the fact that we're seeing this now in 2026. Even as recently as 2024, Congresspeople Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush were both pushed out of office. And now you have these 3 figures coming out, unseating really powerful members of Congress, sitting members of Congress, and the anointed choice of the Democratic Party establishment. It also shows us, Malika, where the energy is in the party going into the 2026 midterms with an eye on the 2028 presidential race. It's very much with that Mamdani wing, that sort of AOC, Bernie Sanders, more progressive wing, right? So that's a sea change for Democrats.
Yeah. Okay, so it's on that sea change that we're going to dive into, because your new book is called Crossing the Red Line, as you mentioned, and you did more than 150 interviews to understand how and why the U.S. enabled Israel's genocide in Gaza, which is a lot. Let me say for our lay people or those not in journalism, that's a lot of work that went into this. Who did you talk to, and how difficult was it to get people to talk?
I appreciate you acknowledging that it was a lot. I mean, it took years, right? And careful relationship building. And it was continuous almost up until the book was completed, because I was looking for a range of people across the US government. So we're talking White House, of course, State Department, intelligence, the humanitarian apparatus, the Defense Department, also Congress. So all these people who are US officials bear a lot of responsibility, and who importantly, our taxpayer dollars fund to make these decisions, right? And a lot of them didn't want to talk. Folks will find that while I have this very broad range of interviews, the vast majority of people really requested anonymity.
Yeah.
And that speaks to A few things. It speaks to the careerism that is endemic in Washington, the sense of, I can't be really brave and courageous, even if I firmly believe something, because what if I don't get my next job? What if I offend someone? That's a bit disturbing, right? It also speaks to the fear about what happens if pro-Israel forces see you publicly out there with your name criticizing Israel. And it speaks to how intense that sense still is. And finally, it really is part of this broader Washington culture that's a lack of accountability for foreign policy. And I really home in on this in the book because I want people to understand, while Joe Biden was the president, Netanyahu was the Israeli prime minister, Hamas, of course, initiated this period with its attack on October 7th. However, the people who were making these decisions, that's dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of people who on a daily basis were choosing to enable this campaign of atrocities, mass starvation, collective punishment, right? And I really wanted to home in on who are these bureaucrats, these public officials making decisions about accountability.
Yeah. I thought it was pretty striking that you actually start the book explaining why there are so many unnamed sources and how you meticulously corroborated their findings and your reportings with them. But it also made me wonder, okay, their names are not in the book, but yours is on the cover. And this book was born out of your reporting an article you did on the cast of characters who helped enable this genocide. So what has it meant for you personally to be the person bringing us this news?
So I'm really grateful to the people who put that trust in me. And I have to say that many of these people have never talked to a journalist before, right? They felt that, their fealty was to doing public service, to being these foreign policy experts. And, they're not trained to do this, right? They don't know how to make it happen, keep themselves safe, keep their families safe. Yeah. But it also speaks to how disturbed people were that they wanted to talk to me, right? And what I found, Malika, was, I started reporting on the discontent in the Biden administration quite early. Really by October 9th, 10th, 11th, people were already just appalled within government, right? And they felt they could come to me. And I'm grateful that they felt they could. And as I built up trust over time, was publishing stories and also showing I was shielding my sources, even when things happened, like the White House issuing a statement calling me a liar. Yes, it's me that's more vulnerable, but ultimately I'm just grateful I can be the vessel for this information that officials who have the visibility feel we, the public, need to know.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go blow by blow with the cast of characters that we just mentioned, the people who helped shape U.S. policy on Gaza under Joe Biden, starting with Biden himself. This is someone who was known as a staunch Zionist.
Yes.
After the war began, he took a trip to Israel, which was pretty unprecedented for a U.S. president during a time of war. How much was Biden guiding the U.S. response?
Biden made himself personally the face of U.S. commitment to Israel. And that trip to Israel where he embraces Netanyahu on the tarmac, that bear hug, right, became the symbol of American complicity, right? There was no blindness about the fact that by that point, Biden made that trip. Netanyahu and his ministers had issued threats of cutting off all food and water, just extreme statements.
That is President Joe Biden descending from Air Force One to meet with Israeli leadership in the middle of a war to show American support and, as mentioned, to help coordinate the war effort.
There it is.
A hug. Yep. Exactly as you predicted right there.
Biden personally was very involved, is what my reporting showed me, but he was very insulated and insular, I was told. Biden was not accessible the way he was even prior to this, earlier in his presidency. So while he was calling the shots, he was really actively involved in that, but he was doing so not necessarily with advice, again, from the people who are closest to these policies, and he was doing so with a really strong conviction in his own rightness. This is someone who at 80 years old had worked on foreign policy for decades. He felt, I know Netanyahu, I know the Israelis, I'm making the calls.
What about his inner circle? Because, of course, there were also talks outside of Gaza and his policy there on just who was in that circle, how were they advising him, were they giving him good advice? So when it comes to this very crucial issue, who do we know?
It's a tight group. It's a group of, importantly, all white men of the same generation, which I think speaks to some of the concern, again, for an administration that casts itself as the most diverse administration, historic appointments of women, of Muslims, of various different groups. However, when it came to this issue that came to define the administration, the people at the table were all white men, sort of 50 and above. And there's three men in particular who were extremely close to Biden in this moment. Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, Brett McGurk, his Middle East advisor, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State. Jake Sullivan, probably the closest to Biden, the most in touch with him about decision-making on this. And what's so important about him is he's seen as the Democratic Party's great hope. He's been presented for 15, 20 years as this brilliant, genius who's going to lead the party forward on foreign policy. But on this issue, he became fixated on minutia. He was unable to adjust his strategy, right? So what my reporting showed was, for example, Jake Sullivan became really obsessed with individual aid delivery of trucks. But when we're talking about mass starvation of more than 2 million Palestinians all over Gaza, distribution problems that the Israelis know about, that kind of narrow focus is not going to cut it. He'd also been really associated with this policy that Biden had promulgated of pushing Palestine to the side, saying we can talk about Israel in the Middle East, Israel becoming friends with Arab countries, without prioritizing Palestinian demands. Very much a policy associated with Brett McGurk, the other chief advisor to Biden on these issues, and someone who, as one advisor told me, Biden almost treated as a surrogate son. So you have to think too about these emotional connections that come in here, right? It's not just strategy, foreign policy. Biden, of course, lost his own son tragically to cancer. So Brett McGurk, who I'm talking about, very much a figure of U.S. foreign policy post 9/11, where this becomes so dominant. A period where the U.S. became really comfortable with brutality in the Middle East, where questions of international law, U.S. law and the use of force were really pushed aside, and where power became so concentrated in the presidency. And then finally, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, one of the most interesting figures. He'd worked with Biden for decades. He had been his foreign policy advisor in the Senate. And from my reporting, Malika, Blinken was very much of this kind of inner coterie of the Biden administration, the person who paid the most attention to Palestinian suffering, would tell colleagues, maybe we need to shift policy, maybe this isn't a good idea, never acted on it once, right? And that is almost a greater tragedy.
Because what is the point of having that power and the ear of the president if you're not using it? Did anyone answer that?
I raised this with, many of these people of sort of what was the point of your being in the room, right? What people sort of argued was we were mitigating the Israeli response and the Israeli brutality in ways that you would never see and in significant ways. What's disturbing to me about that is that invites us as, the observers of this and participants in this policy, again, through our tax dollars, as to sort of say, well, okay, if you got the deaths down from 5,000 to 1,200, that 1,200 is okay, right, on this day. But then we're all in that gray zone with these Biden administration officials.
Yeah, you mentioned that gray zone. But as you mentioned, there was some dissent. So let's talk about that because it happened almost immediately. Some people might remember Josh Paul, the State Department official who resigned from the bureau that oversaw arms transfers to foreign nations. That happened in October 2023. He became sort of the public face of dissent. But your reporting shows that he wasn't alone.
Yeah. So, I broke the news of Josh Paul's resignation, and it was part of what was so striking to me about him was this was someone who had been an arms dealer to a bunch of regimes implicated in human rights violations. That was really significant. And the dissent was often among those people who had that kind of strategic and foreign policy background, saying, I don't want to be part of this. There were people in the administration who were, trying to lobby their bosses for different policies, trying to prepare dissent cables and memos, recommendations. The administration's response, Malika, was often to treat this more as a matter of identity than of ideas, right? So they were saying, well, we are the most diverse administration. We hear all voices. We hear you. What do you do with that? And the clearest example that several officials brought up to me was the White House, as the dissent was bubbling up in October, said, we're going to have sessions with, appointees across agencies who are disturbed.
Yes.
held a different session for Jewish appointees and a different one for Muslims.
Right. And I know people who were in that session, and it felt at the moment like, okay, this is progress. Maybe it's happening slowly and secretly, but this is progress. And then
it just became, oh, this was just about checking a box, as one official said it to me, right? It became about saying, we gave you that opportunity, now shut up and go along, right? What I also heard often from people who were disturbed with the policy, especially humanitarian and intelligence officials, so people who kind of have the greatest expertise to say, look, we can tell you what the Israelis are telling you is wrong or distorted, is that they felt either stymied or challenged in a way they never had been in any other setting. And this was something where even at the White House level, figures like Jake Sullivan, Brett McGurk, these top advisors to Biden would challenge and question humanitarian and intelligence officials heavily. I also heard, again, disturbingly, that there were efforts to kind of even shape intelligence assessments at the lower level before they would go out, right? To sort of put them in a narrative that's more favorable to Israel or more favorable to the policy.
Okay, well, Akbar, let's talk about the title of the book.
Yep.
Because a lot of your reporting and the book focus on the Israeli invasion of Rafah in May of 2024 as this pivotal moment. Biden had been hinting for months that there were limits to U.S. support, and then he publicly drew a limit. He publicly drew a line and said invading Rafah without a plan to limit suffering would cross a red line. Israel, of course, we know now, did cross that line, but the Biden administration didn't change course. Why do you think that was?
That moment is so significant because it contains within it two big factors. Biden's own acknowledgement by that point, 4 or 5 months into the war, that his policy was a humanitarian catastrophe and a strategic failure. And you have, right before this, the World Central Kitchen killing in April of 2024, this horrific Israeli targeting of 2 cars where there were foreign aid workers killed after hundreds of Palestinian aid workers had been killed. It was those foreign aid workers that got the White House to sit up and pay attention. And Biden did apply pressure to the Israelis. The Israelis in April did increase aid. They did change their targeting practices. So what you have at this point is the awareness that policy is a failure and the proof that they're applying pressure works. That's why Rafah matters, because they chose not to apply the pressure on Rafah. And this was a culmination of so many red lines, Malika. I mean, already the prohibition on attacking hospitals, for example, the targeting of journalists, the, again, collective punishment, this constant dual use list of the Israelis, which kept out supplies, all of that had already been crossed. Now the Israelis openly violated Biden's line. And instead of reacting to that, what you saw the administration do was very quickly turn to echo the Israeli narrative, which is chilling, right? And of course sends a message to the Israelis of, after this, you can go ahead quite confident that no real pushback is coming.
Akbar, you write that the policy was choice by choice, a moral and strategic disaster, but not a master plan. And I think that's probably the hardest to grapple with, because if it wasn't a master plan, why did they never change course? What did you hear from people about the logic driving the policy to keep supporting Israel, no matter the red lines that were being crossed?
It was a culmination of so many kind of toxic dynamics in the U.S.-Israel relationship and then in U.S. foreign policy making broadly, right? So there was intense political fear. They were very much looking to, what will Republicans say about us? What will the leaders of these institutional Jewish American organizations say about us, even if those don't represent even the majority of American Jews, much less the majority of Americans, right? So there was that kind of obsession, especially with an election looming. There was also a real failure in the Biden administration to be honest and frank about what they were part of, right? To me, what became so clear about this was, or what kind of crystallized this was the failure to even acknowledge one war crime or violation of international U.S. law. Just one. There would be such pushback about, well, the Israelis say they didn't mean to strike this. They didn't mean to do that. That kind of failure is also about deflecting blame, right? And a sort of way of, well, if we just don't say it's a war crime, we can't be blamed for it. and we can't be blamed for not acting on it. So that kind of personal, I would say, weakness, right? And certainly cowardice that was endemic at the administration at all levels is really what's part of the failure here.
You know, Akbar, we all know history repeats itself. And the only way to ensure it does not is to have an honest, thorough reckoning of what went wrong. So I view this book as the real autopsy for the Democratic Party instead of the one that we got. But that said, many of the architects, many of the faces that we saw throughout this campaign and Biden's administration on Gaza's policy, what they're doing now might make it seem like it doesn't matter what they did. So I'm thinking of Jake Sullivan. He's now Harvard's inaugural Kissinger Professor of the Practice of Statecraft and World Order. It's a mouthful. John Kirby is at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. We've seen some at graduations. We've seen others get some policymaking positions. The list goes on. Did you hear from any of them on the record?
Corporate boards, Harvard professorships. The one who was willing to speak on the record, now a professor at Harvard, Samantha Power. Interestingly, someone who wrote a book about genocide and the US failing to prevent genocide, right, in many instances, did speak with me to an extent, was limited in her willingness to criticize her colleagues, which I think really speaks to, again, this coziness, right? Mm-hmm. Certainly, we've seen these people go into corporate boards. You see Brett McGurk, again, the disastrous advisor, be on CNN all the time, cheering on the Iran war, right? Very much still shaping the public discourse. So I think the Democratic Party does need to have that kind of sense of, do we want these people advising our 2028 candidates? Do we want them shaping our discourse, shaping our think tanks? You know, you see Jake Sullivan coming out and saying, well, I would stop weapons to the Israelis now. What were you doing for 16 months, right? What he said to me was, oh, I brought the option to Biden, and Biden didn't choose to do it. I think the way to look at it, and what I think will really shape how Democrats can have a reckoning about it is the continuity between Biden and Trump, the way that these same people, post-election, no longer having an electoral fear about criticizing Israel, instead of creating a new line on Palestine, talking about international law, joined Trump in attacking the ICC. They created Lebanon and Gaza ceasefires that very clearly had flaws. That question mark of why were we continuous into Trump and then into these devastating wars in Iran, then another war in Lebanon, and of course continued suffering in Palestine.
Well, that begins to answer the final question I have for you, but maybe you can dive a little deeper because, you know, at the top of the show, we talked about how Democrats are now having to confront the reality that their base has moved pretty dramatically on Gaza and how we may be seeing a new face of the party that's starting to take hold. But Biden's policy on Gaza is going to have lasting effects. And you write, the next bloodbath will be easier for us to normalize, which is so chilling, but so true. Do you see a way to change course?
I think there's two kind of big streams in which this can happen. One is through a real sense of a return to some level of international human rights standards, the laws of war. I mean, that's what happened in Gaza. And we've seen people powerfully write about this, how Palestine has been a laboratory for tactics of brutality then used elsewhere. That kind of acknowledgement of let's rein it in, let's kind of pull the US back to being part of that global community, rather than, as on Gaza, the Biden administration, which said we are bringing America back to be with its allies, was an outlier, right? I think future Democrats will want to be more aligned with where maybe Europeans, countries in the global South are shifting. And then I also think for Democrats, the message has just become Gaza encapsulates the sense of an out-of-touch elite, an out-of-touch policy-making elite, politicians who are very separate from the base, and kind of say, as I write in the book, the Biden administration's message consistently was, trust us. So that kind of hollow messaging is not going to be enough. People are going to demand tangible steps. And I think elected representatives who actually look and think like the base, rather than the sense that the base is always pushing an entrenched establishment that is really, really very different from them.
Akbar, thank you so much for this conversation, for this book, and for your reporting. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Malika.